Hi guys! Tonight we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating rulers, a woman who transformed England from a divided, struggling nation into a global powerhouse. Elizabeth I didn't just wear a crown, she wielded it like a weapon against anyone who dared underestimate her. For 45 years, she outsmarted kings, defeated armadas, and created what we now call the Golden Age of England. This isn't just another boring history lesson about dates and battles. This is the story of a woman who refused to be controlled, who turned her greatest weaknesses into her most powerful strengths, and who literally changed the course of world history. We'll explore her tumultuous childhood, her incredible rise to power, the deadly political games she played, and how she became the template for every strong female leader who came after her. From surviving multiple assassination attempts to creating the cultural renaissance that gave us Shakespeare, Elizabeth's story has everything: palace intrigue, international warfare, romantic scandals, and political genius that would make modern politicians weep with envy. So grab your favorite drink and get comfortable, because we're about to spend the next few hours unraveling the incredible life of the woman they called the Glorious Queen. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Tudor entered this world on September 7th, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, and from the very moment she drew her first breath, controversy surrounded her like a storm cloud. The circumstances of her birth were unlike anything England had ever witnessed before. Her father had literally split the country from Rome, defied the Pope, dissolved centuries-old monasteries, and executed his most trusted advisor, Thomas More, all for the chance to marry Anne Boleyn and hopefully produce a male heir. The political earthquake that preceded Elizabeth's arrival had already cost thousands of lives and fundamentally altered England's relationship with the rest of Europe. Henry had convinced himself, and tried to convince his subjects, that God would reward his defiance of papal authority with a son who would secure the Tudor dynasty for generations to come. Instead, on that September morning, the royal physicians emerged from the birthing chamber to inform the king that he had another daughter, not the prince he desperately needed, but a girl who would have to carry the weight of her father's disappointment for the rest of her life. The elaborate preparations that had been made for a male heir suddenly seemed almost mockingly inappropriate. Tournaments had been planned, celebratory proclamations drafted announcing the birth of a prince, and foreign ambassadors had been alerted to prepare congratulations for the arrival of England's future king. Instead, these documents had to be hastily modified. The tournaments were cancelled, and the atmosphere of celebration that should have surrounded a royal birth was replaced by a palpable sense of anticlimax and anxiety about the dynasty's future. Henry's reaction to Elizabeth's birth was diplomatically controlled, but privately devastating. He had risked everything for this child, and she was not what he needed to justify the enormous personal and political costs of his break with Rome. The king's disappointment was so obvious that even foreign diplomats commented on his subdued response to becoming a father again, noting that he seemed more concerned about the implications for his reign than pleased about the addition to his family. Her father, King Henry VIII, had literally torn England apart from the Catholic Church just to marry her mother, Anne Boleyn, hoping desperately for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Instead, he got Elizabeth, a daughter he initially saw as a crushing disappointment. The irony is almost poetic when you consider that this unwanted girl would become the greatest monarch England ever produced, far surpassing any son Henry could have imagined. But Elizabeth's early years were marked by trauma that would have broken most people. When she was just 2 years old, her world exploded in the most horrific way possible. Henry, frustrated by Anne's failure to produce a male heir, and probably already infatuated with his next wife, Jane Seymour, decided that Anne had to go. The charges against Anne Boleyn were almost certainly fabricated. Adultery, treason, even allegations of relations with her own brother. But in Henry's court, truth mattered less than royal convenience. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London, her head severed by a French swordsman's blade. Elizabeth, barely understanding what death meant, was suddenly motherless and, worse yet, officially declared illegitimate by her father's decree. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Elizabeth learned before she could even properly speak that love was dangerous, that trust could be fatal, and that even the closest family bonds could be severed as easily as her mother's neck. She was stripped of her title as princess and relegated to the status of the king's bastard, dependent entirely on Henry's volatile moods for her very survival. Her household was drastically reduced. Her clothing became shabby, and the courtiers who once bowed to her now barely acknowledged her existence. Yet even in these dark, early years, Elizabeth displayed the intelligence and resilience that would define her reign. Her governess, Cat Ashley, became more than a caretaker. She became Elizabeth's emotional anchor in a world that had proven itself fundamentally unreliable. Under Cat's guidance, and later under the tutelage of brilliant scholars like William Grindal and Roger Ascham, Elizabeth threw herself into learning with an intensity that amazed everyone around her. By the age of 6, she was already studying Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, displaying a linguistic gift that would later allow her to conduct diplomacy personally with foreign ambassadors. Her education wasn't just academic, it was strategic, preparing her for a world where knowledge truly was power, and where the ability to outthink your enemies could mean the difference between a crown and a grave. The young Elizabeth also learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with a skill that bordered on supernatural. Her survival during these early years required constant vigilance and an almost preternatural ability to read the intentions and moods of the adults who controlled her fate. She learned to be charming without being forward, intelligent without being threatening, and loyal without being naive. These skills would serve her well throughout her life, but they came at an enormous psychological cost. Elizabeth never learned to trust completely or love without reservation, and her relationships throughout her adult life bore the scars of these early experiences with betrayal and abandonment. The little girl who had watched her world collapse when her mother was executed developed defense mechanisms that protected her but also isolated her, creating the complex personality that would both fascinate and frustrate her subjects for decades to come. When Henry married Jane Seymour and finally got his precious son Edward, Elizabeth could have easily been forgotten entirely, relegated to some remote manor house and erased from the line of succession. The birth of Prince Edward in 1537 seemed to solve Henry's succession problems and make his daughters irrelevant to the dynasty's future. However, Elizabeth's response to this potential marginalization demonstrated the political intelligence that would define her later career. Rather than retreating into obscurity or resenting her new brother, she cultivated a genuine affection for Edward while positioning herself as a valuable member of the royal family who deserved continued support and recognition. Her relationship with Jane Seymour was particularly important during this period, as the new queen had no personal animosity toward Henry's previous daughters and actually worked to improve their positions within the royal household. Elizabeth's ability to win Jane's support while maintaining her dignity and self-respect showed a sophistication that was remarkable in someone so young and demonstrated her innate understanding of how relationships and alliances functioned in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. The education Elizabeth received during her childhood was extraordinary, even by the standards of Renaissance royalty, reflecting both her own intellectual gifts and the recognition by her tutors that she might someday need to rule in her own right. Her instruction went far beyond the typical accomplishments expected of noble ladies to include serious study of classical languages, philosophy, theology, history, and political theory that would prepare her for the complexities of governance. William Grindal, her first serious tutor, was a Cambridge scholar who recognized Elizabeth's exceptional abilities and tailored her education to develop her natural talents while providing the broad knowledge base she would need as a potential ruler. When Grindal died of plague in 1548, he was replaced by Roger Ascham, whose teaching methods emphasized critical thinking and practical application rather than mere memorization of classical texts. Under Ascham's guidance, Elizabeth developed the analytical skills and intellectual confidence that would enable her to hold her own in discussions with the most learned men of her age, while also acquiring the cultural knowledge that would make her court a center of Renaissance learning and artistic achievement. Instead, she carefully cultivated relationships with her new stepmother and later with Henry's subsequent wives, Catherine Parr in particular. Catherine Parr proved to be a godsend for Elizabeth, not only restoring her to the royal household, but also ensuring she received the finest education available in Tudor England. Under Catherine's influence, Elizabeth was exposed to Protestant theology and humanist philosophy, ideas that would later shape her approach to governance. More importantly, Catherine Parr demonstrated to Elizabeth that a woman could be intelligent, influential, and respected without sacrificing her femininity or her political power. The relationship between Elizabeth and Catherine Parr was profound and lasting, showing Elizabeth that there were ways for women to wield authority even in a male-dominated world. However, this period of relative stability was shattered when Henry died in 1547, leaving 9-year-old Edward as king under the regency of his uncle Edward Seymour, later the Duke of Somerset. Elizabeth, now 13, found herself once again in a precarious position, her future entirely dependent on the goodwill of men who saw her as either a useful pawn or a dangerous threat to their own ambitions. The most dangerous period of Elizabeth's adolescence came when she was nearly 16, living in the household of Thomas Seymour, Catherine Parr's new husband and brother to the regent Somerset. The political dynamics of this period were incredibly complex, with various factions competing for influence over the young King Edward, while positioning themselves for the uncertainties of a minority reign. Thomas Seymour represented everything that was dangerous about ambitious men in positions of power. He was charming, intelligent, and completely without scruples when it came to advancing his own interests. His behavior toward Elizabeth was inappropriate from the very beginning, but it became increasingly problematic as time went on, and his political ambitions grew more desperate. The relationship between Seymour and Elizabeth has been debated by historians for centuries, with some viewing it as harmless flirtation and others seeing it as predatory behavior that could have destroyed Elizabeth's reputation and political prospects forever. What makes the Thomas Seymour episode particularly significant is how it demonstrates Elizabeth's developing political acumen even in the most dangerous personal circumstances. Rather than being passive victim of Seymour's inappropriate advances, Elizabeth appears to have understood from early on that the situation was potentially catastrophic for her future and began taking steps to protect herself even while maintaining the appearance of innocent compliance. Her servants later testified that she was often fully dressed and prepared when Seymour arrived for his morning visits, suggesting that she had anticipated his behavior and taken precautions to avoid compromising situations. When Catherine Parr discovered Seymour and Elizabeth in what appeared to be a romantic embrace, Elizabeth's immediate removal from the household was handled with a dignity and composure that impressed even those who suspected her of improper conduct. Her letters from this period show a young woman who understood that her reputation was her most valuable political asset and who was determined to protect it regardless of the personal cost. The investigation that followed Seymour's eventual arrest for treason put Elizabeth in mortal danger, as his enemies sought to implicate her in his plots against the government and destroy her political future. The interrogation Elizabeth endured at age 15 was probably one of the most terrifying experiences of her young life, as skilled questioners attempted to trap her into admissions that could have resulted in her execution or permanent exclusion from the succession. However, her responses to these investigations revealed the same political genius that would characterize her later reign, combining apparent honesty with careful ambiguity and demonstrating an understanding of legal and political principles that amazed her questioners. She never denied Seymour's inappropriate behavior entirely, which would have been obviously false and damaged her credibility, but she consistently minimized her own involvement and emphasized her youth and innocence in ways that made it difficult for her enemies to build a case against her. Her famous response when asked about marriage proposals, that she would never marry without the consent of the King's Council, showed remarkable political sophistication for someone her age, and established patterns of careful, calculated responses to sensitive questions that would serve her well throughout her life. What happened between Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour remains one of history's most debated questions, but the evidence suggests a deeply inappropriate relationship that bordered on predatory behavior. Seymour would enter Elizabeth's bedchamber in his nightgown, tickle her while she was still in bed, and engage in what contemporary accounts described as overly familiar physical contact. When Catherine Parr was present, she sometimes joined in these sessions, but when she wasn't, Seymour's behavior became increasingly concerning. The situation reached a crisis point when Catherine allegedly discovered Seymour and Elizabeth in a compromising embrace, leading to Elizabeth's immediate removal from the household. The scandal could have destroyed Elizabeth's reputation permanently, marking her as damaged goods in the marriage market and casting doubt on her moral fitness to rule. However, Elizabeth's response to this crisis revealed the political genius that would define her later reign. Rather than breaking down or admitting to any wrongdoing, she maintained her dignity, cooperated with investigations, and emerged from the scandal with her reputation intact. When Thomas Seymour was later executed for treason in 1549, Elizabeth had learned perhaps the most important lesson of her young life, that her sexuality and her political power were inextricably linked, and that any misstep in matters of the heart could prove fatal to her ambitions. This experience shaped her approach to marriage and romantic relationships for the rest of her life, teaching her to use the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool while never actually surrendering her independence to any man. When Edward VI died in 1553 at the age of just 15, England faced a succession crisis that would test Elizabeth's political skills to their absolute limits. The young king's death was not unexpected, as he had been ill for months with what was probably tuberculosis, but the political maneuvering that surrounded his final weeks created a constitutional crisis that threatened to destroy the Tudor settlement and plunge England into civil war. Edward's strong Protestant convictions and his fear that his Catholic sister Mary would reverse the religious reforms of his reign led him to attempt an unprecedented alteration of the succession, bypassing both his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, the Protestant granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. This decision was probably influenced more by the Duke of Northumberland, who had effectively controlled Edward's government, and who saw Mary's accession as the end of his own power and possibly his life, than by Edward's own political judgment. The 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey represents one of the most dramatic episodes in English history, and one of the most crucial tests of Elizabeth's political survival skills. Jane herself was an unwilling participant in Northumberland's scheme, a highly educated and devoutly Protestant young woman who understood better than most that accepting the crown meant challenging the legitimate succession and risking her life for political advantages that would primarily benefit others. Elizabeth's position during this crisis was extraordinarily delicate. She had to avoid supporting Jane's usurpation, which would have made her a traitor if Mary successfully claimed the throne, while also avoiding any appearance of disloyalty to the Protestant cause that Jane represented. Her solution was characteristically brilliant, maintaining a careful neutrality that avoided commitment to either side while she evaluated the likely outcome of the struggle. Elizabeth's decision to publicly support Mary's claim, even knowing that Mary was a devout Catholic who would likely attempt to restore Catholicism to England, demonstrated her pragmatic understanding that legitimacy mattered more than religious preference in matters of royal succession. This was not an easy choice for someone who had been raised Protestant and who understood that a Catholic restoration might threaten her own position as heir. But Elizabeth's political instincts told her that the English people would ultimately support the rightful heir over a usurper, regardless of religious considerations. Her early and public declaration of support for Mary probably saved her life, and certainly secured her position as heir apparent. But it also required her to balance her Protestant convictions against the practical necessities of political survival in ways that would influence her approach to religious questions throughout her later reign. The collapse of Jane Grey's brief reign vindicated Elizabeth's political judgment and demonstrated her superior understanding of English political culture compared to more experienced politicians like Northumberland, who had badly misjudged popular sentiment. Mary's triumphant entry into London was greeted with genuine enthusiasm by crowds who saw her as the rightful queen regardless of their religious preferences, proving that English respect for legitimate succession was stronger than religious partisanship. Elizabeth's role in this triumph was carefully managed but significant. She rode beside Mary during the victory procession, symbolically representing the continuity of the Tudor dynasty, while also demonstrating her loyalty to the new queen. However, Elizabeth also understood that this moment of triumph would not last, and that Mary's Catholic convictions would inevitably create conflicts that would test the religious settlement that had been developing since Henry's break with Rome. Her decision to publicly support Mary's claim, even knowing that Mary was a devout Catholic who would likely restore Catholicism to England, demonstrated Elizabeth's pragmatic understanding that legitimacy mattered more than religious preference in matters of royal succession. When Mary successfully claimed the throne after Jane Grey's 9-day reign collapsed, Elizabeth initially found herself in a relatively secure position as the recognized heir apparent. However, this security proved to be an illusion, as Mary's determination to restore Catholicism and her marriage to Philip of Spain created new dangers for Elizabeth that would test her survival skills once again. Mary's reign, which lasted from 1553 to 1558, was a nightmare period for English Protestants and a constant source of anxiety for Elizabeth. The speed and intensity of Mary's Catholic restoration caught many people off guard, as the new queen moved quickly to reverse the religious changes of the previous 20 years and restore England's traditional relationship with Rome. Within months of her accession, Mary had restored the Latin Mass, begun negotiations for England's reconciliation with the papal authority, and started the process of returning confiscated church lands to religious institutions. These changes were popular with some English people who had never fully accepted the Protestant Reformation, but they created enormous anxiety among those who had benefited from religious change or who held sincere Protestant convictions about salvation and church governance. The persecution that earned Mary the nickname Bloody Mary began gradually but escalated into systematic terrorism against Protestant leaders that shocked even some Catholics who supported the religious restoration. The burning of prominent Protestant bishops like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer was intended to demonstrate the Crown's commitment to Catholic orthodoxy and discourage Protestant resistance. But these executions actually strengthened Protestant resolve while creating martyrs whose deaths would be remembered and commemorated for centuries. Elizabeth watched these burnings with horror and growing fear, understanding that her own Protestant beliefs made her a potential target, and that Mary's increasing religious fanaticism might eventually override family loyalty and political calculation. The Queen's marriage to Philip of Spain in 1554 brought additional foreign pressure for Elizabeth's elimination, as Spanish advisors viewed her as a heretical bastard whose very existence challenged Catholic legitimacy in England. Elizabeth's survival during this period required extraordinary diplomatic skill and psychological resilience, as she had to maintain her Protestant convictions while outwardly conforming to Catholic requirements and avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as disloyal or threatening. She attended Mass when required, participated in Catholic ceremonies when absolutely necessary, and maintained cordial relationships with Mary and Philip while never compromising her fundamental religious beliefs or her commitment to the Protestant settlement that she hoped to restore someday. This careful balance between outward compliance and inner resistance was emotionally and spiritually exhausting, requiring Elizabeth to live a double life that few people could have sustained without breaking down or making fatal mistakes. Her ability to maintain this balance while under constant surveillance and suspicion demonstrated not only her political skill, but also her psychological strength and moral courage. The most dangerous moment came in 1554, when Thomas Wyatt led a Protestant rebellion against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, creating exactly the kind of crisis that could have provided Mary with an excuse to eliminate Elizabeth permanently. Wyatt's rebellion was motivated by genuine patriotic concerns about Spanish influence in England and sincere religious objections to Catholic restoration, but it was also poorly planned and executed, collapsing within weeks and providing Mary's government with an opportunity to crack down on Protestant opposition. Although Elizabeth had no involvement in the rebellion and may not have known about it until it was already underway, her Protestant sympathies made her an obvious suspect, and several of Wyatt's followers were tortured into making statements that could be interpreted as implicating her in the plot. Elizabeth's arrest and imprisonment in the Tower of London was probably the most terrifying experience of her entire life, as she knew that many people who entered those walls never left alive. The Tower had been the scene of her mother's execution 18 years earlier, and Elizabeth was acutely aware that the same fate could easily await her if Mary's government decided that she represented an unacceptable threat to Catholic restoration and Spanish alliance. The psychological pressure of imprisonment in the place where her mother died, combined with the knowledge that her life depended entirely on Mary's mercy and the inability of her enemies to prove their charges against her, would have broken most people. However, Elizabeth's response to this crisis demonstrated the same combination of intelligence, courage, and political sophistication that would characterize her later reign. Her famous letter to Mary from the Tower, written in her own hand in March 1554, is one of the most remarkable documents in English political history, combining personal appeals for mercy with sophisticated legal arguments and subtle assertions of royal dignity that impressed even her enemies. In this letter, Elizabeth maintained her complete innocence of any involvement in Wyatt's rebellion, while acknowledging her sister's authority and expressing appropriate contrition for any appearance of disloyalty. She also cleverly reminded Mary of their shared royal blood and their common interest in maintaining the Tudor dynasty, subtly suggesting that Elizabeth's execution would damage the royal family and potentially destabilize the succession. Most importantly, the letter demonstrated Elizabeth's complete mastery of the rhetorical and legal conventions that governed 16th-century political communication, proving that she possessed the intellectual and cultural qualifications necessary for royal authority. Elizabeth's 2-month imprisonment in the Tower was probably the most terrifying period of her life, as she knew that many people who entered those walls never left alive. However, even under this extreme pressure, Elizabeth displayed the cool intelligence and political acumen that would make her a legendary ruler. She maintained her innocence consistently, provided carefully crafted answers to all interrogations, and never gave her accusers the evidence they needed to justify her execution. Her famous letter to Mary from the Tower, written in March 1554, is a masterpiece of political communication, maintaining her loyalty to the Queen while subtly asserting her own innocence and dignity. When no concrete evidence could be found linking her to the rebellion, Elizabeth was eventually released and returned to court. But the experience had taught her that her life would always hang by a thread until she either gained the throne herself or eliminated all potential threats to her survival. The final years of Mary's reign were marked by Elizabeth's careful cultivation of relationships with key nobles and her strategic positioning for the succession that everyone knew was coming. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain had produced no children. Her health was clearly declining, and Elizabeth's status as heir apparent was becoming increasingly secure. However, Elizabeth never allowed herself to become complacent, understanding that in Tudor politics, fortunes could change overnight and that she needed to be prepared for any eventuality. She continued her studies, maintained her Protestant beliefs while avoiding open confrontation with Mary's Catholic policies, and carefully built a network of supporters who would be crucial when she finally ascended to the throne. Her relationship with Mary remained complex and often tense, but Elizabeth managed to avoid any major missteps that might have prompted Mary to reconsider the succession. When Mary finally died on November 17, 1558, Elizabeth was ready to assume power immediately, with plans already in place for her coronation and government formation. Elizabeth's accession to the throne at the age of 25 was greeted with widespread celebration throughout England, but the challenges facing the new queen were absolutely staggering. The religious divisions that had torn England apart for a generation showed no signs of healing, with Catholic and Protestant factions viewing each other with suspicion and hatred that had been intensified by years of persecution and counter-persecution. Many Catholics viewed Elizabeth as illegitimate and supported the claims of Mary, Queen of Scots, who, as a Catholic and the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, represented what they saw as the rightful succession to the English throne. Protestant expectations were equally challenging, as many of Elizabeth's supporters expected her to implement radical religious reforms that would completely eliminate Catholic influences from English society and align England with the most militant Protestant powers in Europe. The international situation facing Elizabeth was even more dangerous than the domestic religious conflicts, as the major European powers viewed her accession with suspicion or outright hostility that threatened England's very survival as an independent nation. France and Spain, despite their own rivalry, were united in their opposition to Protestant England and their support for Catholic claimants to the English throne. The Pope had excommunicated Elizabeth and released her Catholic subjects from their allegiance, creating a theological justification for rebellion and foreign intervention that made every Catholic in England a potential enemy of the state. Scotland remained under French influence through the regency of Mary of Guise, mother of Mary Queen of Scots, creating the possibility of coordinated Catholic attacks on England from both north and south. Ireland was barely under English control, with Gaelic lords maintaining their traditional hostility to English rule and their loyalty to Catholic Christianity, making the island a potential base for Spanish or French intervention. The royal treasury was not merely empty, but deeply in debt, with Mary's government having borrowed heavily to finance unsuccessful wars against France and costly attempts to restore Catholic institutions that had been dissolved during the Protestant Reformation. Elizabeth inherited debts that represented several years' worth of normal royal revenue, limiting her ability to finance the military preparations that would be necessary to defend England against the multiple threats she faced. The English economy was struggling with inflation, unemployment, and trade disruptions that had resulted from religious conflicts and international isolation, making it difficult to generate the tax revenue that would be needed for effective government. Perhaps most challenging of all, Elizabeth's government lacked experienced administrators and military leaders, as many capable officials had been purged during Mary's reign, while others had fled abroad to escape religious persecution. The very concept of female rule remained controversial and untested, as England had no traditions or precedents for women governing in their own right, rather than as regents for minor sons or absent husbands. Elizabeth's legitimacy was questioned not only by Catholics who viewed her as a bastard, but also by some Protestants who believed that women were inherently unfit for political authority and that God's natural order required male leadership in both church and state. The pressure for Elizabeth to marry immediately and transfer real authority to a husband was enormous, coming not only from foreign suitors and their diplomatic representatives, but also from her own council and parliament, who believed that only marriage could provide the political stability and military protection that England desperately needed. This pressure was intensified by the universal assumption that Elizabeth needed to produce an heir quickly to prevent a succession crisis that could plunge England into civil war or foreign domination. Elizabeth's response to these overwhelming challenges demonstrated the political genius that would define her 45-year reign, as she developed strategies for managing competing demands while maintaining her independence and advancing English interests. Rather than attempting to solve all her problems immediately, which would have been impossible and probably counterproductive, she prioritized the most urgent threats while buying time to strengthen her position and develop long-term solutions. Her approach to the religious question exemplified this strategic thinking, as she avoided both the radical Protestant reforms that would have alienated Catholics and the concessions to Rome that would have betrayed her Protestant supporters, instead developing a moderate settlement that satisfied neither extreme but provided a foundation for national unity. Perhaps most challenging of all, Elizabeth was an unmarried woman in an age when female rule was considered unnatural and dangerous, requiring her to prove her fitness to govern while simultaneously managing the constant pressure to marry and produce an heir. The expectations placed on the new queen were contradictory and seemingly impossible to fulfill. She needed to be strong enough to command respect, but feminine enough to maintain social acceptance. Decisive enough to govern effectively, but flexible enough to compromise when necessary. And independent enough to maintain her authority, but marriageable enough to secure the dynasty's future. Elizabeth's coronation on January 15, 1559, was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to establish her legitimacy and win popular support. The procession through London was a masterpiece of political theater, with Elizabeth deliberately choosing to appear both regal and accessible, magnificent yet approachable. She wore a golden gown and a crown that had been specially made for the occasion, but she also made frequent stops to acknowledge the crowds, accept flowers from children, and listen to speeches from city officials. The coronation ceremony itself took place at Westminster Abbey, where Elizabeth was crowned by Owen Oglethorpe, the Bishop of Carlisle, since the Archbishop of Canterbury and most senior bishops had refused to participate in the crowning of a Protestant queen. The choice of Oglethorpe was politically significant, as he was one of the few Catholic bishops willing to perform the ceremony, sending a signal that Elizabeth intended to govern as queen of all English people, not just Protestants. The coronation oath was also carefully worded to avoid committing Elizabeth to specific religious policies while affirming her determination to govern according to law and justice. However, the real test of Elizabeth's reign would come not in the pageantry of her coronation, but in the practical challenges of governing a divided nation in an increasingly dangerous world. The first major challenge Elizabeth faced as queen was the religious settlement that would define her reign and determine England's relationship with the rest of Europe. Mary's restoration of Catholicism had been deeply unpopular with many English people, but there was also significant Catholic sentiment in the country, particularly among the nobility and in certain regions. Elizabeth needed to find a religious policy that would satisfy Protestant expectations while not alienating Catholics so completely that they would support foreign invasion or domestic rebellion. The solution she developed, working closely with advisors like William Cecil and Matthew Parker, became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, and it was a masterpiece of political compromise that balanced competing religious demands while establishing Elizabeth's authority over the English Church. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1559, restored the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England, but significantly, Elizabeth chose the title Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head, a subtle distinction that acknowledged religious sensibilities while maintaining royal control. The Act of Uniformity, also passed in 1559, required the use of a new Book of Common Prayer that was Protestant in theology but retained enough traditional elements to be acceptable to moderate Catholics. Elizabeth's approach to religious policy was characterized by what historians call her via media, or middle way, attempting to create a broad church that could accommodate the majority of her subjects regardless of their specific theological preferences. Unlike her predecessors, who had imposed their religious views through force and persecution, Elizabeth generally preferred persuasion and compromise, famously declaring that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. This approach was not born of indifference to religious questions, but rather from a sophisticated understanding that religious uniformity, imposed through violence, was ultimately counterproductive, and that a stable kingdom required the consent of the governed. The Elizabethan church settlement incorporated Protestant theology regarding salvation and scripture, while maintaining traditional church structure and ceremonial elements that provided continuity with England's Catholic past. Church services were conducted in English rather than Latin, but they retained much of the beauty and solemnity that had characterized medieval worship. Clergy were allowed to marry, breaking with Catholic tradition, but were required to maintain high standards of education and conduct. Most importantly, the settlement was deliberately ambiguous on many contentious theological points, allowing individual believers to interpret doctrine in ways that satisfied their personal convictions while maintaining outward conformity to the established church. The success of Elizabeth's religious policy can be measured by the fact that it survived not only her own reign, but continued to define English Christianity for centuries afterward. However, the settlement was not achieved without considerable opposition and ongoing challenges. Catholic recusants who refused to attend Protestant services faced fines and other penalties, though Elizabeth generally preferred financial punishment to physical persecution. Protestant radicals, particularly the Puritans, complained that the settlement retained too many popish elements and pressed for further reforms throughout Elizabeth's reign. International Catholic powers, led by the Pope and supported by Spain, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the English Church and actively worked to undermine Elizabeth's religious policies through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and support for Catholic plots against the Queen. The Jesuit missions that began in the 1570s brought highly trained Catholic priests into England with the explicit goal of reconverting the population, creating a security challenge that forced Elizabeth to adopt increasingly harsh measures against Catholic activities. Nevertheless, the fundamental structure of the Elizabethan religious settlement proved remarkably durable, providing the foundation for England's emergence as a major Protestant power and creating the religious identity that would define English culture for generations. Court life during Elizabeth's reign was a complex and fascinating world that combined medieval traditions with Renaissance innovations, creating an environment that was simultaneously sophisticated and dangerous, cultured and cutthroat. Elizabeth understood that the royal court was not merely her residence, but a vital political institution that served as the center of government, diplomacy, and social life for the entire kingdom. She deliberately transformed the court into a theater where political power was displayed, alliances were formed, and potential threats were neutralized through elaborate protocols and ceremonies that reinforced her authority while providing channels for noble ambition. The queen's daily routine was governed by ancient rituals that had been refined over centuries. From the morning ceremony of dressing, which involved dozens of courtiers and established precise hierarchies of access to the royal person, to the evening entertainments that could include dancing, music, poetry, and dramatic performances. Elizabeth was a gifted performer who understood that monarchy was fundamentally about creating and maintaining an aura of majesty that convinced her subjects that she possessed almost supernatural authority to rule over them. The physical structure of Elizabeth's courts, whether at Whitehall, Greenwich, Hampton Court, or any of her other palaces, was designed to reflect and reinforce political relationships through architecture and spatial arrangements. Access to the queen was strictly controlled through a series of rooms and antechambers, with each level of access corresponding to political importance and royal favor. The presence chamber, where Elizabeth held formal audiences and received foreign ambassadors, was designed to overwhelm visitors with displays of wealth and power, featuring expensive tapestries, gold plate, and elaborate throne settings that made clear the vast distance between the queen and even her most important subjects. The Privy Chamber, where Elizabeth conducted more private business with her closest advisors, was smaller but even more luxuriously appointed, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that made those granted access feel privileged and special. Elizabeth's private apartments were forbidden to all but a handful of trusted women, creating an inner sanctum where the queen could relax her public persona and conduct the most sensitive political business away from prying eyes. This careful management of space and access meant that proximity to Elizabeth became a form of currency that could be granted or withdrawn based on political considerations, creating intense competition among courtiers for the queen's attention and favor. The men and women who populated Elizabeth's court were drawn from across Europe, creating a cosmopolitan environment that reflected England's growing importance in international affairs, while also serving as a sophisticated intelligence network that kept the Queen informed about developments throughout the continent. English nobles competed intensely for positions in the royal household that provided not only steady income and political influence, but also opportunities for personal enrichment through royal grants, monopolies, and marriage alliances that could transform modest gentry families into great aristocratic dynasties. The competition for court positions was so intense that it created its own economy of bribes, favors, and political alliances, with ambitious families investing enormous sums in the clothing, gifts, and entertainment necessary to catch the Queen's attention and maintain her favor once gained. Foreign ambassadors maintained permanent residences at Elizabeth's court, not merely to conduct formal diplomatic business, but to gather intelligence about English policy, lobby for their government's interests, and monitor the complex factional struggles that influenced royal decision-making. These diplomatic representatives were often among the most sophisticated and well-educated men of their generation, capable of conducting conversations in multiple languages about topics ranging from classical literature to military technology, and their presence at court contributed to the intellectual ferment that made Elizabeth's reign such a remarkable period of cultural achievement. The Queen's own linguistic abilities, she was fluent in French, Italian, Latin, and Greek, with some knowledge of Spanish and German, allowed her to conduct personal diplomacy without interpreters, giving her enormous advantages in negotiating with foreign representatives who often underestimated her knowledge and capabilities. Scholars, artists, musicians, and writers from throughout Europe sought royal patronage that could provide both financial security and intellectual prestige, creating an environment at Elizabeth's court that rivaled the great Renaissance centers of Italy and France for cultural sophistication and artistic innovation. The Queen's genuine appreciation for learning and the arts, combined with her understanding of how cultural patronage could enhance England's international reputation, made her court a magnet for talent that might otherwise have been attracted to wealthier or more established cultural centers. Elizabeth's personal library contained thousands of volumes in multiple languages, and she was known for her ability to discuss complex philosophical and theological questions with university scholars, while also appreciating popular ballads and folk entertainments that connected her with common people. The physical environment of Elizabeth's courts was carefully designed to impress visitors with displays of wealth and sophistication, while also providing practical facilities for the complex business of governing a major European kingdom. The great halls where Elizabeth held formal audiences were decorated with tapestries depicting classical and biblical scenes that demonstrated her education and piety, while also including distinctly English elements that emphasized her independence from foreign influence. The presence chambers contained elaborate displays of gold and silver plate that had been accumulated over generations of Tudor rule, creating visual symbols of royal wealth and permanence that were essential for maintaining diplomatic credibility and domestic authority. Private apartments were furnished with the finest examples of contemporary craftsmanship, including furniture, carpets, and decorative objects imported from across Europe and the expanding world of English trade and exploration. However, the beauty and sophistication of Elizabeth's court should not obscure the fundamental reality that it was also a place of constant political maneuvering, personal rivalry, and potential danger for anyone who made enemies or lost the Queen's favor. Elizabeth deliberately cultivated an atmosphere of competition among her courtiers, believing that jealousy and rivalry would prevent any individual or faction from becoming powerful enough to threaten her authority. She was famous for her sudden changes of mood and unpredictable displays of anger that could humiliate even her most trusted advisors. But these emotional outbursts were probably as much calculated political theater as genuine emotional responses, serving to keep courtiers off balance and remind them that their positions depended entirely on royal pleasure. The Queen's legendary temper, which could erupt without warning and devastate its target with cutting remarks or even physical violence, was one of her most effective tools for maintaining discipline and control over the hundreds of ambitious people who surrounded her daily. Stories of Elizabeth throwing shoes at courtiers who displeased her, or reducing grown men to tears with her verbal attacks, circulated throughout Europe and contributed to her reputation as a formidable ruler who could not be manipulated or controlled by anyone. At the same time, Elizabeth could display extraordinary generosity and personal warmth toward those who served her faithfully, creating intense personal loyalty that went far beyond mere political calculation and contributed to the stability of her government throughout even the most dangerous crises of her reign. Elizabeth was exceptionally skilled at managing these competing interests, using her charm, intelligence, and political acumen to extract maximum benefit for England while maintaining the delicate balance of relationships that kept her court functioning smoothly. She was fluent in French, Italian, Latin, and Greek, allowing her to conduct personal diplomacy with foreign representatives without relying on translators who might misrepresent her positions. Her education in classical literature and philosophy provided her with cultural references that impressed even the most sophisticated European intellectuals, while her genuine appreciation for music and poetry made her a generous and discerning patron of the arts. However, life at Elizabeth's court was not merely a series of elegant entertainments and learned conversations. The court was also a place of intense political intrigue, where careers could be made or destroyed by a careless word or a misunderstood gesture. Elizabeth deliberately encouraged competition among her courtiers, believing that rivalry and jealousy would prevent any individual or faction from becoming too powerful and threatening her authority. She was notorious for her unpredictable moods and sudden changes of favor, keeping even her closest advisors constantly uncertain about their standing and preventing them from taking her support for granted. The Queen's famous temper, which could erupt without warning and devastate the target with cutting remarks or physical displays of anger, was probably as much a political tool as an emotional response, serving to maintain discipline and remind courtiers that their positions depended entirely on royal pleasure. At the same time, Elizabeth could be extraordinarily generous to those who served her faithfully, providing pensions, estates, and honors that elevated loyal servants to positions of wealth and status they could never have achieved otherwise. The combination of potential reward and constant danger created an atmosphere of intense loyalty mixed with perpetual anxiety that characterized court life throughout Elizabeth's reign. The question of Elizabeth's marriage dominated political discourse throughout the first 20 years of her reign, creating a source of constant speculation, international diplomacy, and domestic tension that would have destroyed a less skilled politician. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth understood that marriage was the single most important political decision she would ever make, capable of determining not only her personal happiness, but the future of England, the Protestant Reformation, and the balance of power in Europe. The pressure on her to marry came from every direction, from her own counselors who feared for the dynasty's survival, from Parliament which regularly petitioned her to take a husband, from foreign powers who saw marriage alliance as the key to English support, and from the general population who believed that unmarried women were unnatural and that kingdoms required male leadership to function effectively. The complexity of the marriage question was staggering, as every potential husband brought with him a complete set of religious, political, and diplomatic implications that had to be weighed against Elizabeth's personal preferences and England's national interests. A marriage to a foreign prince would necessarily involve some degree of subordination to foreign influence and might require religious concessions that could undermine the Elizabethan settlement, but it could also provide military protection and diplomatic alliances that England desperately needed. A marriage to an English nobleman would avoid foreign complications, but might create domestic faction and jealousy, while failing to provide the international support that could protect England from Catholic invasion. The decision not to marry at all would preserve Elizabeth's independence and England's sovereignty, but would also leave the succession unsettled and create the possibility of civil war or foreign conquest when Elizabeth died without an heir. Elizabeth's approach to marriage negotiations was characterized by what historians have called her diplomatic virtuosity, using the possibility of marriage as a tool for advancing English interests while never actually committing to any course of action that would limit her future options or compromise her fundamental principles. She maintained simultaneous courtships with multiple suitors for years at a time, allowing each to believe that he was her preferred choice, while actually using their competition to extract maximum political advantage for England. Her correspondence with various suitors demonstrates remarkable skill in maintaining romantic interest while avoiding specific commitments, creating hope and expectation that kept negotiations alive for years without ever reaching definitive conclusions that might foreclose other opportunities. The emotional and psychological dimensions of Elizabeth's marriage question were as complex as the political considerations, reflecting her deep-seated fears about the dangers of intimate relationships based on her traumatic childhood experiences with abandonment and betrayal. The execution of her mother when Elizabeth was barely 2 years old had taught her that love could be literally fatal, while her experiences with Thomas Seymour during her adolescence had demonstrated how sexual relationships could be used as weapons against women who dared to seek political power. Elizabeth's famous declaration that she was already married to England was not merely political rhetoric, but probably reflected genuine emotional conviction that personal relationships were incompatible with the total dedication required for effective rule. The most serious and emotionally complex of Elizabeth's romantic relationships was with Robert Dudley, later the Earl of Leicester, whom she had known since childhood and who represented everything that was both attractive and dangerous about the possibility of marriage for love rather than political advantage. Dudley was the son of the Duke of Northumberland, who had tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, making him politically suspect from the very beginning of Elizabeth's reign. However, he was also intelligent, charming, physically attractive, and genuinely devoted to Elizabeth in ways that transcended mere political ambition, creating a personal connection that lasted throughout their lives despite the impossibility of marriage. The Holy Roman Emperor's sons, the kings of Sweden and Denmark, various French princes, and numerous English nobles all sought her hand, viewing marriage to the English queen as a path to unprecedented power and influence. Elizabeth understood that marriage was not a personal decision for a monarch, but a political tool that could determine the fate of nations, and she used the possibility of marriage with extraordinary skill to advance English interests while maintaining her personal independence. Her approach to the marriage question was characterized by deliberate ambiguity and strategic delay, keeping multiple options open while never committing to any specific course of action that might limit her future flexibility. The most serious and emotionally complex of Elizabeth's romantic relationships was with Robert Dudley, later the Earl of Leicester, whom she had known since childhood and who became the love of her life. Dudley was intelligent, ambitious, and devastatingly handsome, but he was also already married and widely suspected of having murdered his wife, Amy Robsart, when she died under mysterious circumstances in 1560. Elizabeth's obvious affection for Dudley created enormous scandal at court and serious political problems for her government, as many nobles feared that she might actually marry him, despite the damage it would do to her reputation and England's international standing. The relationship between Elizabeth and Dudley was passionate and enduring, lasting in various forms for nearly 30 years. But it was also politically impossible given the circumstances of his wife's death and his relatively modest social origins. Elizabeth's handling of this relationship demonstrated both her emotional complexity and her political sophistication, as she managed to maintain her deep personal attachment to Dudley while never allowing it to compromise her political position or damage England's interests. She eventually elevated Dudley to the peerage and gave him important government positions, but she never married him, despite persistent rumors and speculation about their private relationship. Elizabeth's most significant foreign suitor was Archduke Charles of Austria, later Holy Roman Emperor Charles II, whose proposal offered the possibility of a powerful alliance with the Habsburg dynasty that could protect England from French and Spanish threats. The negotiations for this marriage were extensive and serious, lasting several years and involving detailed discussions about religious arrangements, the Archduke's role in English government, and the succession implications of any children that might result from the union. Elizabeth genuinely considered this marriage as a way to strengthen England's international position, while potentially producing the heir that everyone expected her to provide. But ultimately, the religious differences between the Protestant Queen and Catholic Archduke proved insurmountable. The failure of these negotiations marked a turning point in Elizabeth's approach to marriage, as she began to understand that any foreign marriage would necessarily involve compromises that could undermine the religious settlement and political independence she had worked so hard to establish. Her later courtships, including the famous relationship with Francis, Duke of Alençon, were probably less serious attempts to find a husband than diplomatic maneuvers designed to advance English interests through the illusion of potential marriage. The French marriage negotiations with the Duke of Alençon, which dominated the 1570s and early 1580s, represented Elizabeth at her most politically sophisticated, using the possibility of marriage to manipulate French policy while simultaneously deterring Spanish aggression and maintaining domestic political balance. Alençon was young, ambitious, and reportedly quite charming. But he was also Catholic, physically unattractive, and involved in French civil wars that made him a problematic ally for Protestant England. Elizabeth's courtship with Alençon was conducted through elaborate diplomatic ceremonies, romantic poetry, and expensive gift exchanges that created the appearance of genuine romantic attachment while actually serving complex political purposes. The Queen famously called Alençon her frog in affectionate letters, and reportedly gave him a ring as a token of engagement, but the entire relationship was probably more performance than reality, designed to keep France neutral in England's growing conflict with Spain. When the marriage negotiations finally collapsed in 1581, Elizabeth had achieved her primary goals of preventing a French alliance with Spain and buying time for England to strengthen its military and economic position, without actually having to sacrifice her independence or compromise her religious policies. By the 1580s, it became clear that Elizabeth would never marry, a decision that had profound implications for English politics and the Tudor dynasty. Her choice to remain single was unprecedented for a ruling queen and required extraordinary political skill to maintain legitimacy and stability without the traditional guarantees provided by marriage and male heirs. Elizabeth transformed her unmarried status from a political weakness into a source of strength, claiming that she was married to England and that all English people were her children, creating a new model of royal authority that was both maternal and sovereign. This rhetorical strategy was brilliantly executed and remarkably effective, allowing Elizabeth to maintain the emotional connection between monarch and subjects that was essential for effective rule, while avoiding the political compromises that marriage would have required. Her famous declaration that she was a virgin queen became a central element of her political identity, symbolizing both her personal purity and England's independence from foreign domination. However, the decision not to marry also created serious succession problems that would eventually contribute to the end of the Tudor dynasty and the union of the English and Scottish crowns under James I. The arrival of Mary Queen of Scots in England in 1568 created the most serious political crisis of Elizabeth's reign, forcing her to choose between competing claims of royal legitimacy, religious loyalty, and political survival. Mary Stuart had been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old, had briefly been Queen of France through her marriage to Francis II, and was widely recognized by Catholic powers as the legitimate Queen of England, since they viewed Elizabeth as illegitimate due to Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. When Mary fled to England after being forced to abdicate the Scottish throne, Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. She could hardly return Mary to Scotland, where she faced almost certain execution, but keeping her in England created enormous security risks and diplomatic complications. Mary was intelligent, beautiful, and charismatic, with a legitimate claim to the English succession and the support of Catholic nobles who viewed her as their natural leader. Her presence in England immediately became a magnet for Catholic plots and foreign conspiracies aimed at overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule, making her simultaneously a guest and a prisoner whose very existence threatened the stability of Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth's initial approach to the Mary problem was characteristically sophisticated, attempting to find a solution that would satisfy competing demands while protecting English interests. She proposed to restore Mary to the Scottish throne under conditions that would guarantee Elizabeth's security and maintain the Protestant settlement in Scotland, a solution that would have eliminated Mary as a threat while demonstrating Elizabeth's commitment to legitimate monarchy. However, these negotiations failed due to the intransigence of Scottish nobles who refused to accept Mary's return and Mary's own unwillingness to accept the restrictions Elizabeth demanded. As the years passed and Mary remained in England under increasingly strict confinement, she became the center of an escalating series of plots and conspiracies that threatened not only Elizabeth's throne, but her life. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and the Babington plot of 1586 all centered on plans to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne, with the support of Spanish military intervention, forcing Elizabeth to adopt progressively harsher security measures and eventually to consider the ultimate solution of Mary's execution. The decision to execute Mary Queen of Scots was probably the most difficult and politically dangerous choice Elizabeth ever made, requiring her to balance competing claims of justice, political necessity, and royal solidarity against the immediate threat to her own survival and England's independence. The evidence of Mary's complicity in the Babington plot, which included her own letters discussing the details of Elizabeth's assassination, made some kind of decisive action unavoidable, but the execution of an anointed queen established a precedent that threatened the entire principle of divine right monarchy. Elizabeth agonized over this decision for months, consulting with Parliament, her Privy Council, and legal advisers while seeking alternatives that might eliminate the threat Mary represented without the political costs of execution. When she finally signed Mary's death warrant in February 1587, Elizabeth reportedly did so with great reluctance and immediately regretted the decision, attempting unsuccessfully to recall the warrant before it could be carried out. The execution itself, which took place at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587, was conducted with all the ceremony due to royal rank, but it sent shockwaves throughout Europe and provided Spain with additional justification for the military action that would culminate in the Armada campaign of the following year. The aftermath of Mary's execution demonstrated both Elizabeth's political vulnerability and her remarkable ability to survive even the most dangerous crises through superior intelligence and diplomatic skill. Catholic Europe was outraged by what they viewed as judicial murder, and Philip of Spain began immediate preparations for the invasion of England that had been planned for years but now became an urgent priority. Elizabeth faced criticism from Protestant allies who feared that the execution would provoke Spanish retaliation that might destroy the Protestant cause in Europe, while domestic Catholics viewed Mary's death as confirmation that Elizabeth's government was fundamentally hostile to their religion and their interests. However, Elizabeth managed to weather this crisis through a combination of military preparation, diplomatic maneuvering, and domestic political management that demonstrated her mastery of the complex art of 16th-century statecraft. She expressed public regret for Mary's execution while privately ensuring that her government was prepared for the Spanish response. She maintained diplomatic contact with France and other potential allies while strengthening England's military capabilities. And she rallied domestic support by presenting the conflict with Spain as a struggle for English independence and Protestant Christianity against foreign tyranny and Catholic oppression. The Spanish Armada of 1588 represented the culmination of decades of growing tension between Protestant England and Catholic Spain, creating the greatest existential threat Elizabeth's realm had faced since her accession to the throne 30 years earlier. The scope and ambition of Philip II's invasion plans were unprecedented in European history, representing not merely a military campaign, but a crusade designed to restore Catholic orthodoxy to England and eliminate Protestant heresy from what Spanish planners viewed as a rebellious province that had illegitimately separated itself from Christendom. The preparation for this invasion had consumed Spanish resources for years, involving not only the construction of the largest naval force ever assembled, but also complex diplomatic negotiations designed to coordinate the invasion with Catholic rebellion in England and support from other European powers who might benefit from Elizabeth's overthrow. Philip's decision to launch the Armada was motivated by a complex mixture of religious conviction, political calculation, and personal anger that had been building for decades as England's power and influence grew at Spanish expense. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots provided the final justification Philip needed, as he now claimed the English throne for himself based on his descent from Edward III and his role as the Catholic champion appointed by God to restore true religion to England. However, the roots of Spanish hostility went much deeper than Mary's execution, extending back to English support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, English piracy against Spanish treasure fleets, and the growing English presence in the Americas that threatened Spanish colonial monopolies established over the previous century. The military preparations for the Armada represented the largest logistical undertaking of the 16th century, requiring coordination between Spanish naval forces, the Army of Flanders under the Duke of Parma, and Catholic supporters within England who were expected to rise in rebellion when Spanish forces landed. The assembly of ships, men, and supplies in Spanish ports during the spring of 1588 was watched anxiously throughout Europe, as the success or failure of the enterprise would fundamentally alter the balance of power between Protestant and Catholic Europe. The Spanish fleet that finally sailed in May 1588 consisted of over 130 ships carrying approximately 30,000 men, equipped with the most advanced artillery available and blessed by the Pope as a holy crusade against English heresy. The English response to the Armada threat demonstrated Elizabeth's remarkable ability to transform a national crisis into an opportunity for displaying the unity and determination that had been building throughout her reign. Her decision to appear personally at Tilbury Camp while the invasion fleet was still approaching English waters was unprecedented for any English monarch and created one of the most iconic moments in English history. Dressed in armor and mounted on a white horse, Elizabeth delivered a speech that perfectly captured the spirit of defiance and national pride that had been developing during her reign. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." This speech, which was carefully crafted to address the concerns about female leadership that had plagued Elizabeth throughout her reign, transformed her gender from a political weakness into a source of strength by emphasizing her maternal devotion to England and her willingness to share the dangers faced by her subjects. The image of the Virgin Queen prepared to die in defense of her realm became a powerful symbol of English independence and Protestant determination that inspired not only the soldiers at Tilbury, but the entire nation as it prepared to resist the greatest military threat in its history. The naval campaign that followed was a masterpiece of English seamanship and tactical innovation that established England as a major naval power, while demonstrating the effectiveness of new military technologies and strategies that would influence European warfare for generations. The English fleet, though smaller than the Spanish Armada, was more maneuverable and better adapted to the coastal waters where the decisive battles would be fought. English ships were armed with longer-range guns that allowed them to attack Spanish vessels while avoiding the close combat that would have favored Spanish boarding tactics and superior numbers. The English commanders, including Lord Howard of Effingham, Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and Sir Martin Frobisher, were experienced sailors who understood both the technical capabilities of their ships and the strategic requirements of defending English waters against invasion. The running battle that took the two fleets from Plymouth to Calais demonstrated English tactical superiority and revealed fatal weaknesses in Spanish planning that had not been apparent during the years of preparation. The Spanish formation, designed to protect merchant vessels and transports against attacks by smaller fleets, proved unwieldy and vulnerable when faced with the hit-and-run tactics employed by English commanders who refused to be drawn into the decisive battle that Spanish strategy required. The failure of Spanish forces in the Netherlands to coordinate effectively with the Armada left the invasion fleet without the troops it was supposed to transport to England, making the entire enterprise pointless, even if the Spanish fleet had succeeded in establishing control of the English Channel. The destruction of the Spanish Armada as an effective fighting force came not primarily from English naval action, though that was significant, but from the combination of English harassment and catastrophic weather that scattered and destroyed Spanish ships as they attempted to return to Spain around the dangerous northern coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The decision by the Duke of Medina Sidonia to attempt this hazardous voyage, rather than fighting his way back through the English Channel, reflected the desperate situation of the Spanish fleet after its failure to rendezvous with Parma's army and the growing shortage of supplies and ammunition that made continued combat impossible. The storms that battered the retreating Spanish fleet were some of the worst in recorded history, driving ships onto rocky coasts and into harbors where they were wrecked or captured by local populations who viewed the Spanish sailors as enemies of their religion and their queen. The human cost of these disasters was appalling, with entire ships' companies perishing in shipwrecks or being killed by hostile locals who showed no mercy to Catholic invaders. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain with such confidence and papal blessing, fewer than 60 returned to Spanish ports, and many of those were so badly damaged that they could never sail again. The estimated death toll of over 15,000 Spanish soldiers and sailors represented one of the worst military disasters in European history, and a blow to Spanish prestige and power from which Philip II never fully recovered. Elizabeth's response to the Armada threat demonstrated her remarkable ability to inspire and organize her people in the face of mortal danger, transforming what could have been a national catastrophe into the defining triumph of her reign. She immediately ordered the mobilization of English naval and land forces, appointed experienced commanders like Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake to lead the fleet, and began the complex logistical preparations necessary to defend the English coast against invasion. However, her most important contribution to the defense effort was probably her role as national symbol and military leader, inspiring confidence and determination throughout England through personal appearances, stirring speeches, and visible demonstrations of royal courage. The most famous example of Elizabeth's inspirational leadership came with her appearance at Tilbury Camp in August 1588, where she addressed the English army assembled to resist Spanish invasion in words that became legendary. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." This speech, delivered while Elizabeth was dressed in armor and mounted on a white horse, became one of the most famous royal addresses in English history, and perfectly captured the spirit of defiance and determination that characterized England's response to Spanish aggression. The naval campaign that destroyed the Spanish Armada was a testament to English seamanship, innovative tactics, and superior technology. But it was also heavily influenced by weather conditions and Spanish strategic errors that contributed to one of the most decisive victories in naval history. The English fleet, though smaller than the Spanish force, was more maneuverable and armed with longer-range guns that allowed English commanders to attack Spanish ships while avoiding the close combat that would have favored Spanish boarding tactics. Sir Francis Drake's raid on Cadiz the previous year had disrupted Spanish preparations and provided valuable intelligence about Armada composition and tactics, while English agents throughout Europe kept Elizabeth informed about Spanish plans and timing. When the Armada finally appeared in the English Channel in July 1588, English forces were ready with a coordinated response that combined conventional naval warfare with innovative fireship attacks and strategic positioning that prevented the Spanish from establishing control of the Channel. The running battle that took the two fleets from Plymouth to Calais demonstrated English tactical superiority and Spanish vulnerability, but the decisive factor proved to be the failure of Spanish forces in the Netherlands to coordinate effectively with the Armada, leaving the invasion fleet without the troops it was supposed to transport to England. The destruction of the Spanish Armada as an effective fighting force came not primarily from English naval action, though that was significant, but from the combination of English harassment and catastrophic weather that scattered and destroyed Spanish ships as they attempted to return to Spain around the northern coast of Scotland and Ireland. After the failed rendezvous with Parma's army at Calais, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, commanding the Armada, had no choice but to attempt the dangerous journey home through waters that Spanish navigators barely knew, and in weather conditions that proved absolutely devastating to ships already damaged by English attacks. Storm after storm battered the retreating Spanish fleet, driving ships onto rocky coasts and into harbors where they were wrecked or captured by local populations. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain with such high hopes and papal blessing, fewer than 60 returned, and many of those were so badly damaged as to be useless for future military operations. The human cost was even more appalling, with estimates suggesting that over 15,000 Spanish soldiers and sailors died during the campaign, representing one of the worst military disasters in Spanish history, and a blow to Spanish prestige from which Philip II never fully recovered. The victory over the Spanish Armada transformed Elizabeth from a successful but still somewhat precarious ruler into a legendary figure whose reign marked England's emergence as a major European power and established the foundation for centuries of English dominance in world affairs. The immediate psychological impact of the victory was enormous, providing Protestant England with unmistakable evidence that God favored their cause over Catholic Spain, and establishing Elizabeth as the divinely protected champion of Protestant Christianity against what her subjects viewed as papal tyranny and foreign oppression. The propaganda campaign that followed the Armada victory was one of the most successful in European history, creating narratives and images that influenced English national identity for generations, while establishing Elizabeth's international reputation as one of the most formidable rulers of her age. The famous Armada portrait of Elizabeth, painted shortly after the victory and now one of the most recognizable images in English art, perfectly captures the transformation of England's position that resulted from the defeat of Philip's invasion. The painting shows Elizabeth with her hand resting confidently on a globe, while Spanish ships founder in stormy seas visible through the windows behind her, symbolically representing England's new role as a global power and Spain's corresponding decline from its previous position of European dominance. The elaborate dress and jewelry displayed in the portrait, combined with the crown and scepter that emphasize Elizabeth's royal authority, create a visual statement of English wealth and power that was designed to impress foreign observers while reassuring domestic audiences about their queen's ability to protect English interests against any threat. The strategic consequences of the Armada victory extended far beyond the immediate military results, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe and creating opportunities for English expansion that had been impossible while Spain maintained naval superiority in the Atlantic. Spanish naval power, while not eliminated entirely, was significantly reduced by the loss of ships and experienced sailors, while Spanish finances were so strained by the cost of the failed invasion that Philip was unable to mount another serious attack on England during the remainder of Elizabeth's reign. This breathing space allowed England to consolidate its domestic religious settlement, develop its economic resources, and begin the process of colonial expansion that would eventually create the British Empire and establish English as a global language of trade and communication. The defeat of the Spanish Armada also marked the beginning of what historians universally recognize as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a period of cultural, economic, and political achievement that made Elizabeth's reign one of the most celebrated in world history. With the immediate threat of foreign invasion removed and Spain's ability to interfere in English affairs significantly reduced, English society was free to flourish in ways that had been impossible during the earlier, more precarious decades of Elizabeth's rule. The Queen's court became a magnet for artistic and intellectual talent from throughout Europe, while English merchants began to compete successfully with Spanish and Portuguese traders in global markets that had previously been closed to Protestant powers. The cultural achievements of this golden age were unprecedented in English history and created artistic standards that continue to influence world culture centuries after Elizabeth's death. The Elizabethan theatre, which reached its peak during the 1590s, produced not only William Shakespeare, but also Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Thomas Kyd, and numerous other dramatists whose works combined classical learning with popular entertainment to create literature that spoke to all levels of society while exploring themes of universal significance. Shakespeare's history plays, written during this period, provided English audiences with sophisticated examinations of kingship, political legitimacy, and national identity that helped create the cultural foundations of English nationalism while entertaining both groundlings and aristocrats with stories of English triumphs and tragedies. Elizabeth's personal patronage of literature and music during this period reflected both her genuine intellectual interests and her sophisticated understanding of how cultural achievement could enhance England's international prestige, while providing domestic entertainment that reinforced political loyalty. Her support for poets like Edmund Spenser, whose epic poem The Faerie Queen celebrated Elizabeth as the ideal Renaissance monarch while exploring complex themes of virtue, power, and religious truth, demonstrated her appreciation for works that combined artistic excellence with political utility. Similarly, her encouragement of composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, who created musical settings for both Protestant and Catholic liturgies, reflected the religious tolerance and cultural synthesis that characterized the most successful aspects of her reign. The economic foundations of Elizabethan prosperity were built on innovations in domestic industry, international trade, and colonial exploration that transformed England from a primarily agricultural economy into an early example of commercial and manufacturing power. Elizabeth's government actively encouraged the development of new industries through grants of monopolies, tax incentives, and protective legislation that promoted domestic production while limiting foreign competition in ways that anticipated later mercantilist economic theories. The growth of London as a commercial center attracted merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs from throughout Europe, creating a cosmopolitan business environment that facilitated innovation and economic growth while providing the capital necessary for overseas expansion. English participation in the Atlantic slave trade, while morally reprehensible by any standard, provided the capital and commercial connections that enabled colonial development and global commerce that eventually made England the dominant economic power in Europe. The establishment of trading relationships with Russia through the Muscovy Company, with the Ottoman Empire through the Levant Company, and eventually with India and the Far East through what would become the East India Company, opened new markets for English goods while providing access to luxury products and raw materials that had previously been controlled by Spanish and Portuguese merchants who had dominated global trade since the age of exploration began. Elizabeth's approach to economic policy reflected her characteristic preference for pragmatic solutions over ideological consistency, supporting free trade principles when they benefited English interests while imposing restrictions and regulations when necessary to protect domestic industries or generate revenue for royal government. Her financial management was generally conservative and successful, avoiding the crushing debts that plagued most European monarchs while maintaining the military and administrative capabilities necessary for effective governance in an increasingly complex international environment. The Queen's personal frugality was legendary, as she carefully managed royal expenses while understanding that appropriate displays of magnificence were essential for maintaining royal prestige and political authority both at home and abroad. The defeat of the Spanish Armada also marked the beginning of what historians call the Elizabethan Golden Age, a period of cultural, economic, and political achievement that made Elizabeth's reign one of the most celebrated in English history. With the immediate threat of foreign invasion removed, English society was able to flourish in ways that had been impossible during the earlier, more precarious years of Elizabeth's rule. The Queen's court became a center of artistic and intellectual activity that attracted talent from across Europe, while English merchants began to compete seriously with Spanish and Portuguese traders in global markets that had previously been closed to Protestant powers. The growth of English naval power, demonstrated so dramatically during the Armada campaign, enabled exploratory and commercial voyages that began England's transformation from a relatively isolated European kingdom into a global maritime empire. Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, Sir Walter Raleigh's attempts to establish colonies in North America, and the founding of trading companies that would eventually control commerce with India and the Far East all reflected England's growing confidence and capability in international affairs. Elizabeth's patronage of the arts during this golden age created cultural achievements that continue to define English civilization centuries after her death. The Elizabethan theater, which produced William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson, represents perhaps the greatest flowering of dramatic literature in human history, combining classical learning with popular entertainment to create works that spoke to all levels of society while exploring themes of universal significance. Shakespeare's histories, tragedies, and comedies provided Elizabethan audiences with sophisticated examinations of political power, human psychology, and moral responsibility that reflected the complex intellectual environment of Elizabeth's court, while entertaining groundlings and nobles alike. The Queen herself was a discriminating patron of literature and music, supporting poets like Edmund Spenser, whose epic poem The Faerie Queen celebrated Elizabeth as the ideal Renaissance monarch, and composers like William Byrd, whose musical settings of both Protestant and Catholic liturgies demonstrated the cultural synthesis that characterized Elizabethan artistic achievement. The economic foundations of Elizabethan prosperity were built on a combination of domestic industry, international trade, and colonial expansion that transformed England from a primarily agricultural economy into an early commercial and manufacturing power. Elizabeth's government actively supported the development of new industries, particularly textiles, mining, and shipbuilding, through grants of monopolies, tax incentives, and protective legislation that encouraged domestic production while limiting foreign competition. The growth of London as a commercial center attracted merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs from across Europe, creating a cosmopolitan business environment that facilitated innovation and economic growth. English participation in the African slave trade, while morally abhorrent by modern standards, provided the capital and connections necessary for colonial development and global commerce that would eventually make England the dominant economic power in Europe. The establishment of trading relationships with Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually India and the Far East opened new markets for English goods while providing access to luxury products and raw materials that had previously been controlled by Spanish and Portuguese merchants. Elizabeth's approach to economic policy reflected her general preference for pragmatic solutions over ideological consistency, supporting free trade when it benefited English interests while imposing restrictions when necessary to protect domestic industries or generate revenue for the crown. Her government's financial management was generally conservative and successful, avoiding the crushing debts that plagued other European monarchs, while maintaining the military and administrative capabilities necessary for effective governance. The Queen personally was famously frugal, carefully managing royal expenses while understanding that appropriate displays of magnificence were essential for maintaining royal prestige and political authority. Her success in managing parliamentary taxation, which required delicate negotiations with representatives who were increasingly assertive about their rights and privileges, demonstrated her political skill and helped establish precedents that would influence the development of constitutional monarchy in England. The economic prosperity of the Elizabethan period provided the foundation for England's later imperial expansion and helped create the social conditions that supported the cultural achievements for which her reign is most remembered. The later years of Elizabeth's reign, from the 1590s until her death in 1603, were marked by increasing challenges that tested the aging queen's political skills and highlighted the limitations of personal monarchy in an increasingly complex world. The Irish 9 Years' War, which began in 1594, proved to be a costly and frustrating conflict that drained English resources and damaged Elizabeth's reputation for military success. The rebellion, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and supported by Spanish military assistance, threatened English control over Ireland and required massive military commitments that strained the royal treasury and created political opposition in Parliament. Elizabeth's decision to appoint her former favorite, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland proved to be a catastrophic mistake, as Essex's military incompetence and political ambitions created a crisis that culminated in his failed coup attempt and subsequent execution in 1601. The Essex Rebellion represented the most serious domestic threat Elizabeth faced during her entire reign, demonstrating that even her legendary political skills could not entirely prevent the emergence of aristocratic opposition to royal authority. The succession question, which Elizabeth had managed to avoid addressing directly for over 40 years, became increasingly urgent as the Queen entered her 70s without having designated an heir or provided clear guidance about the future of the Tudor dynasty. By the 1590s, it was obvious that James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots and great-great-grandson of Henry VII, was the most likely successor to the English throne. But Elizabeth's refusal to name him officially as her heir created uncertainty that worried politicians and encouraged foreign interference. Elizabeth's reluctance to settle the succession reflected her deep understanding of the dangers involved in naming an heir while she was still alive, as such a designation could create competing centers of political loyalty and potentially encourage plots to accelerate her death. However, her silence on this crucial question also created anxiety among her subjects and opportunities for ambitious politicians to advance their own interests by positioning themselves as supporters of various succession candidates. The Queen's famous declaration that her successor must be determined by legal right rather than personal preference provided little practical guidance and left Parliament and the Privy Council to manage the transition when it actually occurred. Elizabeth's physical and mental decline during her final years was carefully managed by her closest advisors, who understood that any appearance of weakness could destabilize the government and encourage domestic or foreign challenges to royal authority. The Queen continued to make public appearances and conduct official business almost until the end of her life, maintaining the illusion of vigorous health while privately struggling with the infirmities of age and the emotional toll of decades of intensive political responsibility. Her famous response to Parliament's petition that she marry, delivered when she was nearly 70 years old, demonstrated that her rhetorical skills remained sharp even as her physical strength waned. Though you have had and may have many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have any that will love you better. This speech, which became known as her Golden Speech, perfectly captured the emotional relationship between Elizabeth and her subjects that had sustained her reign through 4 decades of crisis and triumph. The end came peacefully at Richmond Palace in the early hours of March 24, 1603, with Elizabeth dying in her sleep after a brief illness that probably resulted from a combination of old age, exhaustion, and possibly blood poisoning from the lead-based cosmetics she had used for decades to maintain her youthful appearance. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty that had ruled England for over a century, and the beginning of the Stuart period that would bring its own challenges and achievements to English history. The transition to James I proceeded smoothly, largely due to the careful planning of Elizabeth's closest advisors, particularly Robert Cecil, who had maintained secret correspondence with James for years to ensure continuity of government. Elizabeth's funeral, held at Westminster Abbey on April 28, 1603, was one of the most elaborate royal ceremonies in English history, reflecting both genuine popular grief for the deceased queen and political necessity of demonstrating the stability and continuity of the monarchy under new management. Elizabeth's legacy extends far beyond the immediate political and military achievements of her reign to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of monarchy, the role of women in public life, and England's position in European and global affairs. Her success in maintaining royal authority while working within constitutional constraints helped establish precedents that would influence the development of limited monarchy in England and provide models for constitutional government throughout the world. Her demonstration that a woman could rule effectively as an independent sovereign challenged traditional assumptions about gender and political authority, inspiring later female rulers and contributing to gradual changes in social attitudes toward women's capabilities and rights. The Elizabethan religious settlement, which balanced competing claims of Protestant and Catholic Christianity while maintaining state control over religious affairs, provided a model for religious toleration that influenced the development of church-state relationships in many countries. Most importantly, perhaps, Elizabeth's reign marked England's emergence as a major European power and began the process of global expansion that would eventually create the British Empire and establish English as a world language. The cultural achievements of the Elizabethan period, particularly in literature and theater, created artistic standards and traditions that continue to influence world culture centuries after Elizabeth's death. Shakespeare's plays, which were written and performed during Elizabeth's lifetime, remain the most widely read and performed dramatic works in human history, providing insights into human nature and political reality that transcend their original historical context. The intellectual ferment of Elizabeth's court, which brought together scholars, artists, politicians, and religious thinkers from across Europe, created an environment of creativity and innovation that contributed to the scientific revolution and the early development of modern philosophical thought. The English language itself was transformed during Elizabeth's reign, incorporating vocabulary and literary techniques from classical and continental sources while developing the flexibility and expressiveness that would make it suitable for global communication and cultural exchange. Elizabeth's political methods and personal style influenced not only her immediate successors, but generations of later rulers who studied her techniques and attempted to apply her lessons to their own circumstances. Her ability to inspire loyalty and affection while maintaining political authority, her skill in managing competing religious and social factions, and her success in conducting complex diplomatic negotiations while building England's military and economic strength provided examples that influenced political leaders throughout the world. The image of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen who sacrificed personal happiness for public service created a model of royal dedication and patriotic sacrifice that shaped expectations of monarchical behavior for centuries. Her use of pageantry, symbolism, and public appearances to maintain popular support while conducting effective government behind the scenes demonstrated the importance of political theater in democratic as well as monarchical systems. Modern historians continue to debate various aspects of Elizabeth's reign and personality, but there is general agreement that she ranks among the most successful monarchs in European history, and that her achievements were remarkable by any standard. Her ability to survive the dangerous politics of 16th century Europe, transform England from a weak and divided kingdom into a major power, and create the conditions for unprecedented cultural achievement would have been extraordinary for any ruler, and was particularly impressive for a woman operating within the constraints of a male-dominated society. The challenges she faced, religious division, foreign invasion, aristocratic rebellion, economic difficulties, and social change were similar to those confronting many contemporary rulers. But her solutions were more creative, her methods more effective, and her results more enduring than those achieved by most of her rivals. The fact that she accomplished all this while maintaining her personal independence, refusing to subordinate England's interests to those of a foreign husband, and creating new models of female political authority makes her achievements even more remarkable. The Elizabeth who emerges from careful historical study is a complex figure whose public persona of royal magnificence and divine authority concealed a pragmatic politician who understood power, managed people brilliantly, and adapted constantly to changing circumstances while never losing sight of her fundamental goals. She was neither the feminist icon that some modern admirers claim, nor the heartless manipulator that some critics suggest, but rather a skilled practitioner of the art of government who combined genuine concern for her subjects' welfare with ruthless determination to maintain her own authority and England's independence. Her reign demonstrated that effective leadership requires not only intelligence and courage, but also the ability to inspire others, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to balance competing demands while maintaining focus on long-term objectives. The lessons of Elizabeth's reign remain relevant to anyone interested in leadership, politics, or the complex relationships between personal character and public achievement. In the end, Elizabeth I succeeded where so many other rulers failed because she understood that monarchy in the modern world required more than just inherited authority or military power. It demanded the ability to win and maintain the consent of the governed through effective governance, inspirational leadership, and genuine concern for the common good. Her famous declaration that she would rather be a beggar and single than a queen and married perfectly captured her determination to maintain her independence and serve her country according to her own judgment rather than submitting to the control of any man or foreign power. This commitment to independence, both personal and national, became the defining characteristic of her reign and the foundation of all her major achievements. She transformed England from a peripheral European kingdom into a major world power, established religious and political institutions that survived for centuries, and created cultural conditions that produced some of the greatest artistic achievements in human history. Most importantly, she demonstrated that effective leadership transcends gender, that power exercised with wisdom and restraint can accomplish more than force or manipulation, and that the greatest rulers are those who understand that their authority exists to serve their people rather than their own interests. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.